now.
Washington Journal continues.
Good morning. Let me introduce you to our two guests for our final segment of the Washington Journal. Rudiger Lenz is with us. He is bureau chief in Washington, D.C. for Deutsche Welle, which is a German radio and TV network. And Hisham Melhem is the bureau chief for As Safir, which is a journalism organization that serves the people of Lebanon. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to start with you, Mr. Melhem. On a day when the U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell is scheduled to give what the administration had billed as a major speech on Middle East peace, there is this front-page story in the Washington Times. Jordan's king seeks guarantees for Israel. It's the only place I've seen it. They call it a special, and it's based from a reporter in London. King Abdullah II of Jordan has embarked on a bold but secretive peace-building campaign aimed at eliciting public guarantees from all Arab states that Israel would be accepted as a state and, quote, integrated, unquote, into the region. What's your reaction?
This will happen definitely when we reach a just and final and lasting peace that will resolve the long-standing Palestinian issue. Absence that, there will be no integration for Israel in the region. It's as simple as that. Obviously, the king, whose country has been in peace with Israel for a few years now, is interested in helping both the Israelis and the Palestinians reach a final agreement. But when Israel will become part of the region, an integral part of the region, only when peace is achieved with the Palestinians, and if that peace is seen not only by the Palestinians but by the rest of the Arab world as just, then Israel will become part of the region.
In other stories today, it looks as though the government in Israel is trying to preempt Colin Powell's speech by saying that unless there's a full week, very strictly interpreted, of no violence, no return to the peace table.
Ariel Sharon was never comfortable with an American deep involvement in the Arab-Israeli peacemaking. He doesn't want the United States to be involved deeply. He would like to deal with the Palestinians in his own way, and he's been using brute force to put down the Palestinian uprising. Israel, in fact, worked very hard with its supporters on the Hill to put pressure on the administration so that Colin Powell will not come up with a very substantive, active American initiative. And that's why I'm not surprised at all that Ariel Sharon will insist on an absolute cessation of any kind of activity on the part of the Palestinians, because he knows in advance that even if Arafat would like to deliver on that kind of promise, he will not be in a position to impose on every Palestinian faction that kind of a total cessation of any kind of activity against the Israelis.
Here are two headlines on that with slightly different points of view. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Israel's Sharon preempts Powell's speech. Premier holds firm on 1 week's peace before talks resume. And in the New York Times, James Bennett's story is headlined this way: aware of U.S. pressure, Sharon insists on calm before talks. Well, those are just a couple of the issues from the Middle East, which we will be turning to you watching us this morning for your questions and comments on. Also, so much coming out of Europe, especially Germany. Let me turn to Rudiger Lenz, first of all, for an explanation for American audiences about what the real meaning of last week's no confidence vote meant for the government in your home country.
It was unexpected, but I think it was necessary. Schröder had a weakening coalition about the involvement of his government in the war against terrorism, especially in sending German troops abroad. So what he did was he was throwing all his power behind the vote of confidence and saying, if that coalition is going to live, it has to show its strength. And I think he made it quite clear that either the coalition was going to support him. He didn't win with flying colors, but only with 2 votes in favor of him. But he showed that he can fulfill and deliver what he promised, a solidarity position of the German government.
How will German troops be used in the effort?
Mostly on the supportive and logistic side. I think they will not be involved in any war fighting, but there is aid from Navy battleships who want to secure some lines of communication and lines of logistic support. There is even a flying hospital offered to be positioned in Uzbekistan if necessary. So this is more of a logistical support, but there's also a rumor that there will be about 100 special forces from Germany maybe participating in the ground war if there is someone coming up.
Lots more to discuss with both of you, but all of our lines are lighted up, so let's get to our viewers' questions. Ashby, Minnesota is first for our 2 guests. Good morning. You're on the air, caller.
Good morning. You know, I've been sitting listening to this since September 11th, and even prior to this. You know, when is the world going to wake up and take responsibility for themselves? When is the world, these world governments going to start doing something for their people?
Well, what do you mean specifically? You're making a general comment. Give us something we can respond to.
What I'd like to look at is, let's look at Russia. Russia spent how much money building nuclear bombs, building a big, strong defense, and now they're eliminating their nuclear bombs, and yet their people are suffering, their people are poor, their people are without food, and where are these countries? How come these countries don't come to America and help the suffering and the poor?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to stop you. There's lots to work with, and we're going a few different directions there. The general point was the world governments taking responsibility for their citizens. Anything there you'd like to work with, Mr. Lentz?
I mean, it always has been a vision that there would be one world government, and that could be the United Nations. But it has been shown in the Balkans, and it shows right now, again, that this world body is not strong enough. So we still have the nation states around the world, which handle their policies very differently. And if you're going to interfere in their domestic policies, then this doesn't look any good. So I think what you really and what you rightly criticized is the realpolitik we face in lots of different countries around the world.
Mr. Malham?
Also, Russia is in a transition, and things are messy by nature in any kind of transition. This is a country that's been ruled for more than 70 years by an autocratic, repressive regime, communism. And that regime created all sorts of problems, economic, social, and political. And now you're trying to rearrange everything in Russia, and you cannot do that in 10, 15 years. I mean, we probably need probably two generations for that transition to be complete. And usually in the nature of transitions, all sorts of weird things happen. And you cannot expect a blossoming of freedom and the blossoming of democratic institutions after 75 years of repressive rule.
What did last week's meetings between the two presidents look like to you, a journalist, a non-U.S. journalist watching this?
I can tell you the interest with which myself and our readers and our viewers used to look at the old symmetry business between the leader of the Soviet Union in the old days and the leader of the United States. And I remember, and I attended many of them. There was a tremendous interest at that time. We used to go to New York to attend the General Assembly only to listen to what's the latest Soviet position at that time. Not anymore. I mean, these symmetry now are regular. The world is not mesmerized by any given meeting now between the head of the Russian Federation and the American president, because Russia now does not have the kind of international influence that it used to have or enjoy when it was the Soviet Union. And in the old days, if you remember, the United States and the old Soviet Union would cooperate or compete to resolve or to undermine local and regional conflicts. Now, Russia, which inherited the Soviet Union, is trying to rebuild itself. It's trying to be on the, not to alienate the United States. Putin is trying to convince George Bush to go slow on the ABM and on the expansion of NATO. Putin knows that he needs American support to get loans from the international monetary institutions, American technology and whatnot. So the relationship now, the nature of the relationship has changed drastically.
Mr. Lentz, did you read between the lines at all in last week's meeting?
For me, it was quite interesting and revolutionary to a certain extent, because I think here, for the first time, atmosphere and sympathy on both sides became the real substance of the summit, because there was no other substance. There was no written treaty. There was no result as such. But if I compare it with the past, as Hashim just did, in the past they disagreed in all subjects, but they found common ground in very detailed measures. That was the old arms talk and the old arms reduction talks and regime. Now they agreed overall in politics, in their views about how to fight the war against terrorism, in their mutual relations, but they disagreed in the substance of very specific items and areas. So I think this has turned from top to bottom, or bottom to top, as you like. So this is a real change in mutual relations between Russia and Washington, which we haven't seen for decades.
Mary in Ohio, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Direct this question to both gentlemen. One of the things that's bothered me, and we don't hear much about it now, is the Bush administration's assertions that they're going to change the intelligence community's long-term anti-terrorist, penetrating these groups. And in the course of doing so, they said they need to go back to the dirty business of spying. This means, the clandestine operations and other things that we read about during the Cold War. If this actually is part of the problem that the Third World has against the United States in the past, where we have been in the process of trying to redirect governments clandestine-wise, how does this sit right now with both of you gentlemen there and the constituents and the people that you have to answer to?
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Appreciate it. Rudiger Lentz.
And the dirty business of spying never stopped. We had it throughout the Cold War, we had it after, we now have the industrial espionage on all countries against all countries. So what do you think might be new that those so-called clandestine operations and intelligence measures have become a new value in the fight against terrorism? And this is undoubted between all the partners of the coalition, that you need to have certain secret measures and knowledge which you're not getting on the open market to fight terrorism effectively. But you are insofar quite right. You have to have that an operation which is legally right and which has to be controlled by the legal governments, and which should not lead towards a government inside the government, like the CIA, for example, was in the 50s or 60s, when they started operations which were not legitimate, which were not by law allowed.
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between spying and covert operations. As long as we have a world dominated by nation states, spying will continue to be a legitimate business conducted by various states against each other. Even allies spy on each other for a variety of reasons. Now, if you're talking about covert operations, especially like those we've seen during the Cold War period, definitely the United States has been guilty in conducting a number of covert operations that are still haunting us till today. There isn't a single man, woman, child in Iran that cannot tell you what happened in Iran in 1953 when the United States, through the CIA, brought back the Shah after he was overthrown and brought down a legitimate government in Tehran. And the list is long. We can go to other countries in the Middle East, to Latin America, to Africa. Those covert operations deserved the label dirty operations, and many of them were conducted illegally, and many of them created severe problems, economic and political dislocations in a number of states throughout the world. So I don't think that there will be a resumption of this kind of operations. I hope not. As far as dealing with shady characters in various parts of the world, I think, unfortunately, this is going to be part of the new emphasis on giving the CIA greater leeway in dealing with these shady characters in order for them to collect as much intelligence information as possible.
Waterloo, in Indiana, is it, or Iowa?
Indiana, yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Welcome to C-SPAN.
Thank you for having me. Gentlemen, I have a little comment for you, and then I'd ask you both to possibly respond. Being American at the 9/11 when we got attacked, a lot of Americans were like, well, let's go to war, let's kill Arabs, let's kill Muslims. And they really were very ignorant to the fact of why America has got to this point. Realizing that Israel is basically a terrorist nation hiding behind the mask of democracy, where they go into Palestinian property, they slaughter Palestinians, they preach Zionism, they hold Palestinian people under lock and key, and the newspapers and the media in America is basically run by the Jewish people, where they don't allow the truth to be out. Just like the gentleman said about the Shah. The Shah was one of the biggest butchers there was, but because it was okay for American interests, we allowed it. And I think what it is, gentlemen, is I wanted to ask you the question is, how can we awaken the American people to the corruptness and the evilness of the Jewish people and how they preach Zionism and how they're in an occupied land? Look where right now they have tanks in people's properties and they're taking people and locking them up under house and key.
Okay, you've made your point. Let's go to respond. You want to start?
It's very easy to come up with a very rational critique of U.S. policy in the Middle East, whether on the Arab-Israeli conflict, on U.S. Policy on Iraq, or U.S. support of a number of Arab regimes and Muslim regimes that are essentially autocratic and repressive. So that, I mean, one can come up with a rational narrative and criticize U.S. policy and stop, and then say nothing. No grievance, no religion, no cause can justify New York. I mean, I don't think any cause can justify the killing of 5 civilians, let alone 5,000 civilians. Now, when we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, clearly there is a nation in captivity called Palestine. It's under occupation. Palestinians got a historic bum rap. They paid heavily because of European persecution of Jews. It's a historical experience there. Now Israel is a fact of life in the Middle East. What the Palestinians and the rest of the Arabs are asking is a measure of justice for the Palestinians, people who lived there for centuries, on their own, to have their own state, to determine their own future side by side with the Jewish land, with the Jewish homeland for the Jews. I don't believe in cabals. I don't believe in conspiracies. It's very easy for me to come up with a rational criticism of Israel, in which I would agree with a lot of Israelis, by the way. I would agree with a lot of American Jews in this country. And I don't like any kind of talk about Jewish control of the press. The Jews in this country are highly educated. They are highly organized, and they play politics in many ways brilliantly. And I would just hope that the Arab Americans and Muslim Americans and other groups play politics in this country as brilliantly and as effectively. I have no problem criticizing Israel. I have no problem criticizing the views of certain Jewish organizations here, just as they criticize the views of various Arab American organizations or Muslim organizations. But generalizations are dangerous, whether we're generalizing about Arabs or Muslims or Jews.
Let me make that quite short. I was wondering about that very black and white point of view you just took, because I think the truth of the Middle East and the problem is much more complex, as well as the position of Jews within the United States. You're an American, I'm a European. But first of all, I think the American Jews are Americans first, and then they have chosen their religion. And this is put on the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of your country, and you have to respect that. I think about the complexity of the issue. The Europeans are trying to keep our ties and bridge the gap between the two conflicting parties. And it is very difficult because they are both telling you stories about the atrocities of the other side, and both are halfway true and halfway wrong. So I think we have to deal with a very complex problem, and we can't deal with it in that black and white point of view.
Let me return to Germany. There's so many ways to take the discussion about the identification of some of the terrorist cells within your home country of Germany. Failure of security, issues about concern for your own citizens and the like. But I'll throw you an open question. What are some of the debates that would be happening, and what are some of the thoughts that you have as the identification of this network shows the extent of it and the length of time that some trail was known about them?
Susan, thank you for that question. I saw it coming, and you're quite right in putting it. But it's not only Germany, as we see from today. It's Spain, it was France. So the Al-Qaeda network had its base before they came to America and put their plan in action. They had their logistic base, their training base in Europe, especially in Germany, and as we now see in Spain as well. How come you're asking that question? And this is a very easy answer. Before the 11th of September, we were very open societies. We were societies like, especially the Germans, who tried to show tolerance against foreigners, who tried to incorporate them, to give them political asylum. Many of those people came over because they claimed they were threatened by their own governments, the countries they came from. So what can you do? Turn them down, send them away after the history of Germany in the 30s, 40s, and 50s? No, we took them, let them live, didn't know what they did, And now we have to we found out what they did and whom they wanted to attack afterwards. So what we are now doing is, as many other European countries as well, we are trying to find out where the right balance between civil liberties, an openness of a society, tolerance against foreigners is, and on the other hand, trying to keep in mind how secure can a nation be and how we can safeguard our own political interests against others.
Richmond, Virginia, you're next for our two guests. Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
Fine, sir. What's your question?
Well, I was interested in the question on Israel and the Palestinians. But this thing been going on for years. And, you know, I read the Bible. I know a lot of people not into that anymore. But it's somewhere like 6,000 years old. And you got that whole thing already documented out. And we know that Israel's not going to give up its Golan Heights. And that's what the Palestinians want. And Israel is using that to protect themselves. And I think somewhere down the line, maybe NATO make an agreement with them to protect it. And that's going to be about the end of it.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to wait for your comment.
Okay, appreciate it. Hisham Milham, would you like to say anything more?
Well, the Palestinians don't want the Golan Heights. The Syrians want the Golan Heights because the Golan Heights belongs to the Syrians, and it was taken by force in 1967. Whether the Israelis will give up this or give up that, look, there's a conflict going on there. We need the political solution for that conflict that takes into consideration the legitimate interest of all sides. In this case, not only the Palestinians and the rest of the Arabs, but also Israel. And I don't want to bring up the Bible. I mean, when we bring all these things into the discussion, if I heard correctly, but this is a very complex conflict. It's been going on for decades, and we need a resolution because the region's future should not be held hostage to an ongoing conflict like this, especially that many people, particularly the Palestinians, paid a tremendous price.
Lancaster, Kentucky, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, the United States has pumped billions and billions of dollars into the Middle East, and they buy arms with it. Why don't they help their people? I know a previous caller touched on this, but instead of them blaming the United States, why don't they overthrow their rotten governments and leave us alone?
Thanks very much. Mr. Lentz, let me ask you a question. We get so many calls here about concerned about the amount of money that the U.S. gives in foreign aid to countries in the Middle East. What about either the EU or Germany in particular? Are there also monies used to create stabilization in that part of the world from your governments?
Susan, what is interesting about it, and they're complaining the same way just our call-in lady did, because the European Union in the last couple of months even spent more than 200 billion marks or euros for the stabilization of the Palestinian authorities. So lots of money from all countries from the Western world, Europe and America, go into that region. In former times, she's quite right, more for arms sales. And they try to achieve something what they call the balance of power. And sometimes the balance of power was going into imbalance, and then we had a conflict. Today it goes more in economic aid and into building of the nation, because the Palestinian nation is not a nation as such at the moment. They don't have police forces, at least they are building police forces. They don't have an effective economy. They lack infrastructure, roads, hospitals, whatever. So the European Union did a lot of that. Hopefully it's paying off in the long run. That's what we call nation building, and we try to help that nation in the emerging process to stabilize the region, as my colleague, Mr. Mellum, just said.
Well, Mr. Mellum, then respond to the frustrated caller, either to an American program, as you just heard, or in Germany, who wants to know what kind of return are people getting for all those years of investment when the hostilities continue?
Major powers, when they give money, they get a lot in return, particularly political influence and probably strategic influence and economic benefits too. In many cases, most of that money comes back to American businesses, in fact. So and that's in fact part of the agreement with between the donors and the countries affected by aid. Look, in principle, the $5 billion that the American government and us as good taxpayers provide for Israel and Egypt, I would be happy if that money is withheld and if that money is spent on combating AIDS and other infectious diseases throughout the poor parts of the world. I have no problem with that at all. But if you're talking about percentage of aid, Europeans usually give a higher percentage of aid in terms of their national GDP to countries. And the United States essentially gives a tiny percentage of the U.S. budget for foreign aid. Now, as far as the frustration of the caller concerning the nature of the regimes in the region, definitely those regimes are repressive. Many of them are not democratic or elected, and I will be extremely happy if those regimes are changed and democracy and pluralism flourishes in the region. The Americans should keep in mind that the United States is a major power, that the United States is involved in the Middle East politically, economically, strategically, as well as culturally. And some of these policies are bound to create a degree of alienation on the part of some people. And that shouldn't be surprising, as long as we understand these policies and understand their effects.
Next call for our two guests comes from Pittsburgh. Good morning.
Morning. I have a question for Herr Lenz. My husband is a retired German Air Force officer, and he currently flies for the airlines. Terrorism is a real threat to my family, but on the other hand, I'm really alarmed at the wave of patriotism and nationalism in the United States. I'm wondering what the German population might think of this, if there's any open discussion about it. I find it terrifying that people in the United States are willing to blindly follow our leader without question, even if it means sacrificing our basic democratic rights.
I have a different opinion to what you just said, because I was astounded, as many of my countrymen as well, that after the 11th of September, the government took its next decisive steps, step by step, on a very rational basis. There was no rushing into a major war. There was no rushing in punishing anyone. So I think that this was what Europe was very happy about it, that the answer of the Americans was not a single-handed out answer. It was coordinated with others. There was the coalition, the political coalition building, which is at least as important as the military strikes we see now unfolding in Afghanistan. And so I think the Europeans, watching America closely at the very beginning, have, for one reason, fallen in line that easily, because they felt comfortable with the American approach of the problem. And to the second thing, patriotism in itself is not bad if people turn out and show that they're supporting their country. And I would expect the same from my country and other countries in Europe if we would have been attacked that way as the Americans have been attacked.
Next is Findlay, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. Couple questions. First of all, I'd like to make a statement that I appreciate how the world has rallied behind us, and I, as an American, want to know how I can support the countries or show a thank you to them for supporting us in this time of need. And a second statement I like to say is, I think my countrymen are a little bit spoiled, because I think during the time of war we all have to make some sacrifices, and I don't think people have accepted yet that this is a time of war. How would you respond to that?
I'm a former military officer, and I was trained in the Federal Armed Forces, but I've never seen a war like that. We never talked about a war like that, because that is a very strange war. And as many people now think, it is the beginning of a new century, also marking a new way of waging wars in other countries, where you try to root out something which we have known as a phenomena since some decades, international terrorism. Which is like a cancer. It's spreading all over. But to be quite frank, this war doesn't affect the American public as such. At least I don't have the feeling. You see it in television, but it's far, far away. And as long as no American soldiers are coming back in body bags, and the American people are suffering great losses, I think this is a war which is still did not sink in our minds that much as you feel when it's closer to you in your neighborhood. But nevertheless, you are right, America is at war. Some other would prefer to say it's a major conflict. The use of the word war is a little bit unusual, at least for Europeans that time, because we still think we are living in a peace, in a time of peace. But you're quite right, it took all our efforts to live through that conflict and bring it to an end.
Can I just say something quickly? Look, Americans have been lucky and blessed because they had this immune system from foreign wars. No American city was bombed, no American city was attacked, no American city was occupied. Unlike European cities from Moscow to Berlin to Russia to Paris to London, they were either bombed or occupied even in the 20th century. And that's why what happened in New York represented a great deal of a historic jolt because it was so new, and it created a sense of violation that no American has felt throughout American history, albeit it's a brief history, but nonetheless, Americans never suffered such an attack on their cities, and that's why we've seen this kind of soul-searching and these kind of reverberations that are going to be with us for a long time to come, and maybe it's useful here to just wonder out loud, I think, about the nature of this new threat, although it's not that new. I mean, in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, practically every political order in Europe was subjected to these kinds of attacks at the hands of the anarchists at that time. Those people who were out there against the state, l'État, and they were as fanatical as bin Laden's groups. And at that time, they did not have airplanes to fly into the World Trade Center, but they used bombs and pistols and went out on suicide missions. So the Europeans have a different history. The Americans' historical experience has been completely different. And now we have this new development, which is new, obviously, and we have to deal with it.
Next call for our guest is New York City. Good morning.
Good morning. I am a German living in New York City. Guten Morgen. I have a question which somewhat continues Mr. Mellem's statement he just made. I thought it was very interesting. My question is somewhat complex about the historic perspective of all these recent events, and I'd like to start with the comment, or rather, I'm sorry, you read from a newspaper a few minutes ago, Ariel Sharon preempted Secretary Powell's speech by saying that there would not be any return to peace negotiations unless there be a whole week of
nonviolence
attacks against Israeli citizens, which he very well knows Mr. Arafat has no control over. So essentially, Mr. Sharon is saying he is at present not interested in peace. Now, if we think about that kind of attitude, right, and look at this in historic perspective, doesn't it seem like any culture, any developing of a society has necessarily, if very unfortunately, had its very violent episodes whenever a significant number of people in a culture think they're not happy with the status quo and it needs to be changed. This is my question to your guests. Would we not have to think that, although this may not be a very pleasant thought, that conflicts like we're facing like now are inevitable and a part of the greater development of civilizations or human civilizations?
Okay, let me stop you because I understand. Thank you very much. And since we had a German citizen, why don't we start with you, Mr. Lenz?
Thank you so much. You're right, conflicts are inevitable. Conflicts are part of our life. I mean, conflicts are always also moving us forward, but you can't let conflicts conquer or dominate the life of majorities of people. By that I mean that you have to try to steer conflicts. You have to try to calm them down. And if conflicts amongst countries, states, peoples or religions try to explode in the manner we have seen it in the Middle East, and we might see it in the future again if it's not steered, if it's not controlled, then you can't just sit aside and say, hey, the history of life, the history of mankind was a history of conflict. Just let them go, let them develop by themselves. I mean, there was the 30-year war in Europe. There was a lot of wars, the religious wars in Europe.
The 100-year war.
We didn't have the opportunity to steer them and to control them. But if we would have, we certainly would have had the obligation to do so.
Can I move to a specific question as opposed to general? There's a U.S. congressional delegation in Lebanon right now. It is led by a Lebanese-American member of Congress, Darrell Issa. A report from Reuters that they met yesterday with various members of the government, including the president and prime minister. And his message is that he wants the Hezbollah faction movement reined in and to help ensure that it stays internal, regionalized, as opposed to being a contributor to this global war on terrorism. What's your reaction?
Obviously, this is a very important issue in Lebanon, the role of Hezbollah. Hezbollah played a decisive role in getting the Israelis out of South Lebanon, the Israeli occupation army, which occupied South Lebanon for more than 22 years. The Israelis withdrew from most of Lebanese territories, with the exception of a sliver of territory called the Sheba Farms. Over the last year and a half, since the Israelis withdrew from Lebanon, minus that piece of land, Hezbollah concentrated its few attacks on Israeli soldiers on that area alone. Hezbollah is not involved in attacking civilians in Israel. And in the past, when Hezbollah would attack civilian settlements in Israel, it would be after the Israeli attacking Lebanese villages, and then Hezbollah would reciprocate by lobbing Katyushas across the border. They've never done that without Israeli provocation. Hezbollah in the past, in the 1980s, did some acts that can be considered terrorism by any definition, such as kidnapping our colleagues, journalists, and others. These are acts of terror. But in the 1990s, when they were focusing on the Israeli occupation in South Lebanon, they were not engaged in terror. They were fighting an Israeli occupation army. Even by the American definition of terrorism that you find in the annual report that they produce every April, you cannot accuse them of supporting terror. Obviously, Hezbollah sympathizes with other Islamist groups in Palestine fighting the Israelis, and this is problematic. I would concede that. The Lebanese government is not going to rein in Hezbollah if by reining in Hezbollah means preventing them from attacking Israeli positions in South Lebanon. But obviously the Lebanese government would be responsible, should be responsible, if elements from Hezbollah did engage in active terror, whether against the Americans or against any other civilian targets outside Lebanon.
So, Mr. Issa, I have a caller waiting. So, Mr. Issa's congressman's urging that Hezbollah becomes political and solves problems through politics.
It's already a political government. Actually, they have...
But not strictly political.
Yes, they have about 8 members in the parliament. They were elected.
But it's not strictly political if it still uses violence.
Absolutely. No, you're right. You're right. I mean, they have a military wing, as they call it, and they are members in the parliament, too.
But his urging that it becomes strictly political, you'd say the time is not right for that, and the government would not...
Personally, I think the time is right. Well, I'm just describing the situation.
The reality of
yes,
exactly. Next call is from Flint, Michigan. Good morning.
Hi, I had a comment for Melem, Mr. Melem. He said that the Israelis, he's basically saying that the Israelis don't want peace by asking for that week. Well, they're dealing with the man Yasser Arafat when he first came into power, who called for the elimination of the Israeli state. And the Golan Heights, he said, was taken in 1967 by force. That was taken by force because they were attacked. Is that not true?
Look, the 1967 war began with the Israelis attacking Egypt and Syria. That's one. As to what Arafat said or did not say, for many decades, the Israelis never recognized the existence of a Palestinian people, let alone the Palestinians' right to have a state of their own, to determine their own future. I can give you quotes from Israeli leaders, and before Israel was established in 1948, from Zionist leaders that would make you cringe, because they drip with hatred and racism against the Palestinians. I mean, you know, we can play that game if you want. It's very easy. Look, the fact is, Israel is there. The Arabs did not welcome the creation of Israel in Palestine because that state was created at the expense of dismantling an already existing Palestinian society in what people refer to as mandated Palestine. Israel now is a fact of life in the region. I have to live with it, although I'm not thrilled by it. I grew up in Beirut watching Israeli airplanes flying over my city, Beirut. Israel has a clear military preponderance because we are very generous as taxpayers, as I told you before. There is a political conflict there. This is not going to be resolved by resorting to religion. This is not going to be resolved by resorting to metaphysics or to absolute positions. It's going to be resolved by giving the Palestinians a measure of justice, something that they very well deserve. And if that remains absent, that conflict is going to continue, and radicals on both sides, on every side, are going to exploit it. It's as simple as that.
Let me bring the conversation back to Europe. In the Financial Times this morning, there's this headline on a story on their Europe page: top German politicians call for radical EU shakeup.
And because we see at the moment there is problems in facing global challenges with the EU never has faced before. I've been a Brussels-based correspondent for the last couple of years before I came here to Washington, and what I have seen was that Europe first, after the fall of the wall, tried to bring its act in order for the next decade or so. That was the European integration, the invention of the euro, and things alike.
With an economic focus.
Absolutely right. And we have been rightly blamed for that we closed our eyes before other problems around us, across the border. What we see now facing the global threat of terrorism, which affects us as it does the Americans, we have to tackle that problem and adjust some of the organizational questions of the EU. And I think that's what at the moment is happening. You have seen that over the weekend there was an EU delegation with the president of the EU Prodi and the so-called foreign expert or foreign ministers, Javier Solana. They were in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and spoke to Arafat as well as to Sharon and tried to bring them back at the negotiation table. So I think the Europeans now clearly face a global challenge, and they're going to tackle it, and they're going to do something about it. And I think they are less reluctant than in the past to involve themselves in global matters.
So before you talked about the United Nations, if I could shorthand maybe or handicap your views, overall, is it seem like thumbs up a better time for the United Nations in being able to solve some of these, but the European Union is being tested? If you look at kind of globalization.
You're quite right. I mean, we have our personal experiences with the United Nations and the Balkans, so I have a split meaning on that, because I think from the idea it would be wonderful to have a UN body which is trustful, which is you can rely on, and which really can solve problems. But the United Nations, as we know, doesn't have its own force, and we have seen in the Balkans that without NATO it didn't work. So now when the United Nations come into the game again concerning Afghanistan and the transition government and things, I think they can play a very important role in nation building, in helping to form a coalition government there. But I think the rest of the burden will be put on the United States and maybe on the Europeans as well to safeguard the process. And the British and the Germans have already pledged their support for those ideas.
For our two guests next, Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome to the program.
Hello.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, hi. I'm sorry for that. Okay. I wonder, America is a great nation, and I consider America as the mother of all this nation. I wonder, America knows exactly the trouble going on between Israel and the Palestinians. And actually, Israel is exercising Holocaust on the Palestinians. Why take America that long to declare independent state in Israel? Because we like to save this great nation from trouble, from terrorists, from everything. We need to live here in peace, and this country is a great. So I don't know why it takes this long. And also Sharon is playing the same game. He needs first security from Arafat. He needs first control for terrorism. He needs to start at every agreement goes beyond every other prime minister coming. So why would it take that long?
Thank you. I guess the question is, why is it taking so long? Came through as a theme.
For the Americans to see the light? It's that incredible, almost unquestioned commitment to Israel that is responsible in part, I'm sure. And there are many reasons for that, historic and political and psychological, and you know, we can enumerate them if you want to, but we need at least two more hours. I think the United States knows that it cannot escape playing an active role. The Bush administration tried in its first few months to avoid making some tough, maybe even painful decisions on the Arab-Israeli conflict. But now, obviously, very shortly, Secretary of State will have to, is going to give a speech in which he would delineate what the United States is ready to do to help both sides. The Americans have a problem with the Sharon government. They do also have a problem with Arafat's leadership and his style of leadership. And, but they have been subjected to a great deal of pressure from a number of Arab states, from the European Union, to be more active and more involved. And I think the Arabs would like to see the United States be faithful to its own principles when the United States talks about inadmissibility of the taking land by force, when the United States says that settlements are not helpful and in fact settlements are illegal. One would or when the United States goes back to its initial position on Jerusalem, which is that the city, or East Jerusalem, is an occupied city, that Israel occupied it in 1967. This is what the Arabs and the Palestinians in particular would like to see the United States pursue. Nobody on the Arab side is asking the United States to abandon Israel or to stop military and financial and economic aid to Israel, but they're asking them also not to forget the Palestinians and not to allow the Palestinians to be at the receiving end of this kind of American support for Israel.
About 8 minutes left for our two guests. Next is Lincoln Dale, New York.
Yes, to the man from Deutsche Welle, first of all, I'd like to thank the German Navy very much for that incident in the Atlantic Ocean where the Lutyens went beside an American ship, the Winston Churchill, and the officers were all in their dress blues, and there was the American flag was in the center of the ship, and there was a sign on the side of the ship that said, "We stand by you." Thank you very much, Germany.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And as to the man from Lebanon, all I can say to you is the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. You had a negotiation at Camp David, or excuse me, in West Virginia, where the Israeli Prime Minister, the socialist Barak, practically gave the country away to Arafat, gave him East Jerusalem. When you said earlier, let's not mention 1967 in connection with the Golan Heights, but you mentioned 1967 in connection with East Jerusalem. At any rate, gave the country away, just gave the right to a Palestinian state.
Well, let's pick it up from there. Okay,
all
right, you've made your point. Thanks. And you actually were agreeing, I think I heard in your voice. You want to comment?
Maybe history will tell, but in hindsight, it might have been the opportunity to find a stable peace for the Middle East, because as far as I recall, there were 97% of what Palestinians demanded was being promised. Okay, the status of East Jerusalem was still a tricky question, but from a sideline point of view, as a European journalist, I had the feeling that this was a great opportunity which was missed, and maybe no Israeli politicians at the moment, and maybe in the near future, will be able to deliver that same amount of goodies to the Palestinians and the same amount of trying to forge a compromise.
The caller is wrong, fortunately or unfortunately. Look, if you want to read what happened at Camp David, read an account written by Rob Malley. He used to be a member of the American delegation there. He used to be a member of the National Security Council. And he debunks that myth that you just repeated uncritically, unfortunately, that Barak, who is not a socialist, by the way, gave the country away. He didn't give anything that is not his. This nonsense that 97% is not true. Israelis wanted to maintain control of large chunks of territory around East Jerusalem. They wanted to maintain roads to the Jordan Valley. They didn't want to give the Palestinians contiguous areas in Jerusalem. There were many issues. If you go back to your history and read it very carefully, it's only a year and a half ago. After Camp David, and I agree that Arafat mishandled public relations at Camp David. Arafat's style of leadership is maddening even to someone who supports the Palestinian cause like me. Arafat made tactical mistakes at Camp David, but after Camp David, they went to Taba in Egypt. They made further progress, and the Israelis said that, and the Palestinians said that. And then Bill Clinton gave a major speech in January of last year, a few weeks before he left office, in which he came up with this so-called parameter speech, in which he was more generous towards the Palestinians than any American president before. I fault Arafat for not jumping on that speech, on that offer, if you will. But Barak did not give the country away. This is Israeli propaganda, especially on the right in Israel. But if you want to read something about Camp David that is written by a thoughtful man who is not an Arab, who is not an Israeli, but an American official, his name is Rob Malley. It was written in the New York Review of Books.
Just a couple minutes left. I'm sure that you are doing a lot of reporting on the state of the U.S. economy post-September 11th, but let me go again to Germany in this case. Is the the German economy also having a difficult time right now?
Not only the German economy, but the European economy as such. I mean, this has partially to do with the aftermath of the 11th of September, but partially also with the weakening of the euro against other currencies, especially against the dollar. We have a large problem, not an increasing, but also not a decreasing problem of unemployment across the board of European countries. So I think what we face is, first of all, we see that the linkage of world economies makes one conflict happening at one location, the conflict of the others as well. We can't avoid it. So what we have to find now is, and we have shown in Ottawa, that there might be light at the end of the tunnel if we all work together with open markets, try to solve our problems together and not against us, and not try to be in any kind closing our borders for other goods and trades. And I think this is the American policy of the moment, as well as the European policy to help our economies out of a certain slump.
Am I correct in the timetable that full euro conversion is slated for January 1st?
Yes, you are.
Is that anticipated by journalists and the government and economists to help the situation or cause more turmoil?
I think we have a 50-50 on that. So most of the people think that the bottom has been reached with the value of the euro against the dollar, but others say that if the people will have the money in its hand, it might even go more down. But I think I'm more on the optimistic side, and I think it will help. And we will see that what was until now an artificial money, only in transfers across the borders, now the people have it in hand in all countries participating, and this is the real stabilizing factor of one monetary union with one political union.
Hackensack, New Jersey, you're going to be our last caller. You're on the air.
Hello.
Good morning.
Okay, I'm a Lebanese living in New Jersey. I have a question actually for Mr. Melhem, and this question is, I read in Time magazine, which is supposedly a very reliable magazine, that there is no press freedom in Lebanon. So what are your comments on this? And for Mr. Lenz, I believe you've watched very well the behavior and of Hezbollah, and would you consider Hezbollah a terrorist organization? And if yes, would you please give me a specific example of a terrorist attack or something that you call a terrorist behavior?
Okay, thanks. So for the two questions, our time is running out, so about a minute for everything.
You don't need Time magazine to tell you whether we have press freedom or not. There are limits on press freedom in Lebanon. We in Lebanon probably we have the oldest press in the Arab world. We have more than 150 years of traditions in journalism, print journalism definitely. Egypt comes next. In the last 10, 15, 20 years, because of the civil war, because of Syrian intervention, because of the rule of the militia, many journalists were intimidated, many journalists were killed, many there are restrictions now on certain issues that have to do with national security or Syrian policy in Lebanon. And anybody who tells you otherwise is lying to you.
I'm not a specialist of Hezbollah, but I have to say that even Mr. Melhem now acknowledged that they still have a military arm, which now here and then conducts some military actions. Some may call it terrorist, others may call it freedom fights, but I think one should judge them by their deeds, and that's what we should all do.
I want to thank both of our guests for being here to help us understand some of the many stories coming out of their homelands in the wake of September 11th. Rudiger Lenz, who is the bureau chief in Washington for Deutsche Welle, and Hisham Melhem, who writes for a daily in Lebanon. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to you for being with us. We are going to be back tomorrow morning beginning at 7 a.m. Eastern Time for 3 more hours of questions and your calls.